I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, "You got this." IEEE is more than just a network, it's a family.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another IEEE USA Livestream webinar, Data-Driven Innovation, Harnessing the Power of Focused Data. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. Our presenter for today is IEEE member Steve Pearson. With a firm conviction that data is the linchpin of innovation and product development, Steve has built his career on the ability to unearth and interpret critical information for competitive advantage. His clients, ranging from legal teams in small companies without dedicated R&D departments to individual inventors and innovators, rely on his experience to decipher trends, identify unknown competitors, and formulate data-driven strategies. Steve previously served as the chairman of the Austin chapter of the IEEE's Power and Energy Society, and his multidisciplinary approach enables him to deliver targeted research, timely updates, and strategic consulting, empowering clients to make informed decisions quickly and cost-effectively. Without further ado, I'll now pass it off to our presenter. Welcome, Steve. We're very excited for what you have for our audience today.
Thank you for having me on your webinar, Jonathan. I really appreciate all your help and your great introduction. You've just been amazingly good with that. So I also want to thank Chris Anderson and Daryl Griffin because they've also been supporting you and me in this endeavor. So thank you to everyone. A quick note, Jonathan, is that I did put the Power and Energy Society in my bio, but we actually have a confusing name. It's called Pi Squared, and it actually represents the Power and Energy Society plus 4 additional IEEE societies here in the Austin area, which is very unusual and very difficult to name. So anyway, that's a little bit of a backdrop on that name. So I have to laugh because I see in the news that the national emergency alert will be generated for our cell phones here in a few minutes. And so that is very unusual, and perhaps this presentation is too, and that's not a precursor to it. So I got to thinking about how to use that to our advantage. And so I thought, well, let's make this into a teachable moment. So this alert that's coming out is coming over our cell phones in a few minutes here. And I've got mine out of the room so it doesn't distract me. But it's a single test and it happens every few years. But it is also an opportunity to learn about innovation and where I'm headed in this conversation. And that is that this is a single test to make sure our systems are working and that when we need to have an emergency alert generated, we can receive it. But some of the things that many people don't necessarily think about is that this has a frequency, in other words, every 3 years. And there's a lot of statistics and data generated behind the scenes, most of which we'll never see, and most of us could care less about. So the challenge for this audience is knowing that we have an opportunity, if we were so interested, to produce a product, a service, or something else that anticipates in 3 years we could leverage this next emergency alert test and have a product that's ready to go based on what we can find out about it. So anyway, that's my challenge to the group if you're interested. So oops, Daryl, can you go ahead and flip it? There we go, sorry. So this slide talks about the 3 things that we're going to be discussing today, and that is that we want to talk about why patent data, which is the emphasis of this conversation, is important to innovation. Also, there's a spectrum of data inside of patent data that can be useful for locating these opportunities. And so also the strategies for what to do with that data, i.e. what does it mean to me, my company in this specific situation that we're in, do for us. Okay. So this slide is got a weather radar on it, and probably everybody in the audience has seen one of these before. And so I'm going to use weather as the metaphor for how we approach this innovation data that we're going to be discussing. And I did spare you. My wife suggested that I wear a Ron Burgundy outfit and get my hair like him. If you can remember Will Ferrell playing him in Anchorman, he was a goofy weatherman. Fortunately for you, I chose to pass on that, maybe next time. So a couple things about this data is that weather radar can be very informative. We may not look at it every day, but it actually has several characteristics that are important to innovation. One is that it can be timely. We don't want the weather radar from yesterday or last year. We want it to be fairly accurate, showing our geographic location with a reasonable certainty that it's fairly accurate. And we also want to kind of be able to look at that and say that weather front will hit my area at this time, or whatever it is that we're looking at. And so there's several characteristics in the immediate need, as well as in the future trends that we can use to kind of predict what we might as a weatherman. So one of the important things as engineers is that we might know already all about radar and how it's generating the data that we get to see here in this format. But the importance of it isn't necessarily important for how we make decisions. So engineers love to have this kind of data sense to it, but the layperson, and I'll just include myself in this for the moment, we only care about the data, and making sure we can interpret it so that we know how to act. So we also get out of this data some interesting things, and I'll call them altitudes for our weather metaphor here. And that is that the altitude of the data, we can have a ground level where we're sitting now on planet Earth. We can have an intermediate level that's above our head at some level. And then we can have the weather radar, let's call it cloud level, where we're looking at something happening and we're looking down at it. And we may not have the data itself, but we probably have enough to make some actionable items out of that. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Jonathan. So this graphic on the right is important, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more because this sets the context of why patent data is so important for innovation. One of the most important ones that many patent attorneys, companies, and other people don't know is that intellectual property as a whole is extremely valuable to companies. And in fact, here in 2020, just a couple years ago, it was found to be 90% of the Standard & Poor's 500 intellectual property value. Overall value. And so that's really important to us because yes, factories are important, the workers are important, the software and the computer systems are important, but in the overall sense of it, they're only 10% of a company's value on average. And so it shows that there should be an importance to intellectual property just in the sense of what's happening inside of companies. But they also are useful because they provide significant clues about the innovations occurring in a particular technology space, market space, whatever you want to call it. Certainly it is also a legal space, but we're not going to look at it necessarily at that lens today. So one of the great things about patent data is that most companies see a huge urgency in filing their patents in a timely manner. And so there are over 4.5 million, maybe it's close to 5 million patents and applications filed around the world every year. And so there's a huge opportunity to look at the statistics of any particular area, even at a very fine-tooth comb, and say, wow, I can see a trend in a space that I thought I knew really well, but now see that maybe I didn't. And so this is also important because patents contain about 80% of the innovative material in the world. And so that's not my data, but it's really important to say that we can find some innovative information in blogs, on the internet, in libraries, and all these other great places. But in essence, most of those are not describing all the 80% of the content that's covered in the patent system. So that would give us focus to go to the patents first and then follow up with what we need later. So one of the other great things about worldwide patents is that most of the content of the United States Patent Office has decreased over the years, as especially like China has picked up the level of activity there, but many other countries have too. And so if you're looking for innovative trends or assignees or anything else, it's important to consider whether you should look outside the United States or not. In fact, some technologies, it's absolutely critical you do that. So with all this, we can see that there's a substantial reason for companies to say, I have a monetary incentive to do this thing that I call patenting and to file it early so that I can lock in a future marketplace. So some of the things that we're going to talk about here to wrap up this slide is that a lot of the large conglomerates, I've worked with some of them, have used patent data in the ways that we've described as a part of their process for both setting their strategy and finding innovations. Okay. So let's start off with what I call the ground level. And the ground level data, if we were literally standing on the earth, as I put in my weather metaphor, we're looking at publications, patent publications, for instance. And so I'll anticipate that everybody that's watching this webinar has seen a patent or a patent application at some point in their lifetime, perhaps a lot of them. Most of you may find them exciting. Some of you may find them boring. Whatever your reason, they do contain a huge amount of data. And fortunately for us, it also includes a lot of metadata, not necessarily in the publication itself. But for our ground level data, let's look at the publication itself. It's got titles, dates, inventors, company names, citations to relevant patents and technology publications, maybe even websites, other sources of information. It can be classified using patent classification systems, of which there are a number of those around the world. It includes a simple write-up, an abstract, but it also includes a specification, a detailed write-up in everybody's language, which is English or whatever your preferred language is. And then it also has the claims, which many people construe as the scope of a patent, and that's the legal claims. And that's true, but all this other technology and market data comes out of those legal claims, as well as the other parts of the publication that I just described. So with that, we're going to use that as the baseline for how we move forward with our other levels of data and where we're headed in the presentation. So we can certainly look at this and say, I see something, and that's great. But the problem is that we're not going to see some of the innovations that are included around these, like in the metadata, such as the frequencies, some of the other things such as legal statuses that are changing, new assignees, etc. So let's go to the next slide, Jonathan. So this one, I didn't have a good graphic for it, and so I grabbed sections of a very large spreadsheet that I created just for this presentation. And so basically it shows what is overall 89 columns of data. And this is just dealing with a single publication, which is a Korean one, but it doesn't matter. It's a publication. And so in these 89 columns of data, we can have a lot of information. We can have things such as a simple country code, a KR, a kind code, which I'm not going to elaborate on here today, but that can also be 2 digits. But we can also have things like descriptions, which can be many hundreds of pages of text long. And so they can be very onerous. And then there's a bunch of things in between. And so this mid-level data is obtainable by different ways. I use an expert patent data provider, and they provide the data that I use. But we can also see some people and companies are actually having people write code to extract this data from the USPTO themselves. And so that's great because basically they're building their own database and they can analyze it any way they care about. But they're leaving a few things behind, such as changes in the legal status, some other information around what's known as patent families, and international IP associated with things that are not in the USPTO. So overall, obtaining and analyzing and implementing this data can be complicated, in some cases expensive, and it's also something that you have to have some sort of in-house research specialists and a database expert that can help you with these things. But it does include some really nice stuff for the engineering group here. I thought, well, something that you may not realize in looking at that ground level data of a patent application or a patent publication is some of this information can include whether a patent is a standard essential patent. such as USB or 5G or some other standard for IEEE or some other group, that can be very helpful to know. We can also learn about whether that patent has expired, expiration dates, any reassignment of the owner to some other party that's been made. And we can also potentially translate it from English into some other language, such as you may prefer to work with that. So overall, this is cumbersome, maybe expensive, requires some in-house expertise. But I also wanted to ask the group here, and you can include this in the chat if you'd like. Jonathan will be watching that for me. Whether you have any preferences for what kind of data analysis methods you use. I use Excel spreadsheets because it's the largest capability of a spreadsheet that I know of, but there may be others that I'm unaware of. And you probably have some sort of database preference for that. But if you have a specific preference that we may or may not discuss, but please include that in the chat and we can go into that later. Okay. Next slide. So you've probably seen charts talking about the number of patents filed for annually by a particular company. That gets into the news cycle quite frequently. And so I started this part of our cloud level, highest level of use of data to spot innovations to include this because that's something hopefully everybody can stay grounded on, pardon the metaphor. So one of the things about cloud level, high level statistics is that this is called patent analytics. Some people call it patent landscaping, and it's the statistical analysis of patents. And this is a lot of patents, or it can be just a few, but typically it's a lot. And so for this company-based search I did and exported, I included a memory cell technology because, of course, there's a lot of activity on it and some recognizable names too. And so one of the things you may notice is that Samsung in this little data sample is shown to have the most patents, as it is in this case. And that was important because they turned on this area in the largest way in 2022. And IBM had been the the largest filer of patents or the receiver of patents for many years. And so that leaves a question of, does that mean that IBM is no longer innovative? Does that mean IBM is now surmounted by Samsung? Does it indicate a change in strategy or perhaps financial strategy not to pay for so many patents, but to continue their innovation in other ways that may not be picked up in the patent space? So there's a lot of questions that I'm not going to address, but that should leave an open question of patent data can be very useful, but it's also can't be taken with a grain of salt. And so there's also missing context in this, and that I deliberately did not include the data that I'm presenting here, what kind of bounds it had as far as years, technologies covered, or anything else to give you that kind of background. And so that's really important because we have to be careful with statistics. And per Mark Twain's infamous quote, there are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so that's really important for our baseline here is that I think statistics are really helpful, but we have to keep them in check. And we also have to balance them against other forms of data and our own knowledge. Ready? So this next slide is showing some things that will help prep us for where to look for innovations inside of patent data. And so on the left, I included what's known as a life cycle curve. And we can think of this as a market adoption curve, perhaps for black and white television sets, color television sets, pencils, pens, or anything else, in that at some point in the past, whatever year that was, those things were very novel, had never been thought of before. And the market, of course, by that time didn't have anything to purchase. And so there were no adopters of that product or that technology. But over time, as those things have become developed, we see much more activity, much more technical activity, much more market presence, people thinking about what's been put out as the new and improved pencil, and then thinking about how do I improve upon that pencil. And so through all of those technology innovations and market adoptions, at some point we kind of peter out, and the market has adopted probably as many pencils as it can. And so at that 100% point or very close to it, we can say the market is saturated. And so by looking at the right side of the curve, basically the differential of that curve, we can see that we can relate that also to innovations, and that there's a lot of activity in the early phase, and that activity is often marked by patenting activity. It also shows that at some point, as it hits the market stage, that there are early adopters, early majorities, and late majorities per this particular graphic. But then there are some laggards that are waiting, have no sense of the market space to need that particular innovation, etc. And so at some point, everybody realizes there's not a lot left to innovate on, and everything kind of drops off as far as technology improvements, as well as patenting activity. It falls off as well. And so the trend is we want to look for where those things are maybe rising, or maybe where they're steady, or maybe where they're falling. And so it's important to understand where your company falls in this, because every company will interpret their innovations differently than some of these other companies. Okay, Jonathan. So one of the things to look at as we look at these two graphics, I'm going to explain those in a minute, is that we have to realize whether your purpose is to be a bleeding edge innovator, an early adopter, or a laggard. Companies make money in each of these areas, but they don't necessarily think about innovations in the same manner. Bleeding edge, somebody invented the transistor at some point. I'm not going to mention names right now. And, that was great. And then there are many innovations after that, and that's fantastic. But the first one to do that innovation is potentially a disruptive innovation. And many of the innovations which follow are incremental or sustainable innovations, because they're improving on something that's already been put out there. Using my pencil metaphor from before, somebody probably thought to add, let's put an eraser on the end, let's put a metal band around the eraser that holds it to the pencil. And all of those things are generally incremental innovations, because they're improving on something that was potentially disruptive in the earlier phases. So let's look a little bit at the graphic here. There's two graphics on the top. Both of these are trends by year. On the top, we have a technology trend chart for 4 different memory cell technologies, again, the same technology space. And on the bottom, we have that same graphic, but we're looking at it from the lens of the companies involved. In this case, I just chose 3 to keep it simple. Those technologies for memory cells, the technology inside of memory cells, we can think of SRAM, DRAM, ROM, EEPROM, etc. And so over the years, we can look at those things and say, wow, they're trending according to some time frame that maybe I anticipated, maybe I didn't. And so it's bringing out some data which may be interesting, or maybe insightful into something that's happened in the past, or maybe gives you some insight into the future. And so if we look at these curves, we can see that EEPROM came up from, let's say, in the 1990s to its heyday in about 2008, of the heyday of patenting activity. And so at that point, it started decreasing. Could we have seen that decrease? Maybe not from just this data, but maybe for some other things such as market information or other sense of what's going on, we could have seen that. And then we have the laggard down here, the SRAM space. The SRAM space, there are certainly companies that operate in this area. I hope they're profitable, but in general, there's not a lot of activity in that space. Does that mean it's not profitable, shouldn't be innovated? No, it just means historically nobody has found a lot to basically innovate and patent. So that could be good or bad depending on your context. So let's move down a little bit further to the Samsung, Hynix, and Micron company trend chart. And we can see that depending on how we want to interpret these curves, that Samsung was really active from 92 up to about 98. And the amount of patenting activity went up significantly. And that's the little up arrow I added there. And so just like the stock market, we can say, wow, am I missing the boat? Did I not see this? Is Samsung really onto something? Or we could say from another sense, such as being a laggard, that, wow, let's let Samsung pay all the money to patent, develop the technology, implement it in the marketplace. And maybe for my laggard company that's still profitable, maybe what we need to do is just follow in their footsteps and let all that activity die down. Let's see what settles out in the marketplace. Let's let their patents expire so we don't have to worry about infringing them and those things. And so that might be the sense of what's happening with the second orange arrow, where we can see that Hynix followed that similar graphic and followed a lot of activity after Samsung, but generally they're lagging a little bit behind. And I don't know Hynix versus Samsung, so I can't allege to know anything about that. But I can say they may have a decision to see what's happening and to follow Samsung's footsteps. And if they are, that could be completely profitable for them as long as it's a strategic decision. Okay, Jonathan. So this slide is showing our data in a different context. It's no longer a trend chart. We're trying to show a level of activity related to both technology across the bottom and to companies across the left. And I didn't give this any time constraints or other information, although that could be added in. So basically, this is a three-dimensional chart trying to relate to us the level of activity by company and technology. And so white space is interesting. That's the title of this. Some of you may have heard of that before. And so white space is literally, for some companies, an opportunity because there's nothing going on or very little. And so as an engineer bad joke, I'll call this hole theory, and that holes do exist, but whether they are an opportunity for us is a matter of contention for how you're positioned. And so this patent data doesn't dig into the other things such as market data, technology data, those things. But basically, looking at this, we can say, wow, there's white space on this, and maybe we can say that Micron or Hynix could see an opportunity in this space because they're not really leveraging what's happening. But they could be a laggard too, and so that could be a very intentional decision. So finally, to wrap up this slide, white space has a close corollary, and that's called green space. And green space is when you look at the white space that's shown in this graphic for patent data looking for innovations. And for green space, you consider some of the other market data, some of the market knowledge, technology knowledge, and other knowledge you may have, and bring that to bear and say, in the green space of this particular set of information, we see opportunity or not. What may look like an opportunity in white space may show up in green space as a don't go there because it's not what I planned on doing. Okay, Jonathan. So I wanted to put this graphic in here just to kind of wet your whistle for what other kinds of ways we can present patent data. And this patent data to me is not very specific, but it is really nice to look at. It's got multiple colors and got some layout, some really nice things on it. And I'm sure some people actually use it. Generally, it's not to my preference because even though it looks really nice, it doesn't provide key information such as quantities and time and relationships that I generally like to see in other more traditional formats. But, if this is something that helps you make the decision you need to do, then, please do it. But it is available in various ways. So this, all of this data that we have here, by it being identified specifically, we could actually download the publications or pull it into a database or spreadsheet and start to look at it in some of the earlier ways that I've already talked about. And so just because you have this data and you have all these sophisticated new questions to ask about why did those things happen and what does this mean to me, where is this headed, etc., now you can download some of those data or analyze it in a different way and maybe answer some of those questions. And so that's the overall point of the cloud level. In fact, even the mid-level is that patent data doesn't necessarily provide all the answers, but it does let you ask some very sophisticated questions that you may not have anticipated otherwise. And so I think that's very powerful. So while we're looking at this slide, realize that there's a lot of ways to present data. And in case you didn't know him, Edward Tufte is a real important person in the data area. And so he is really interesting. I saw him. He's from Yale, I believe, and he came through Austin and did a presentation and has a series of books about presenting data. Really interesting person. He's both a statistician and an artist. And I don't know how many people can claim that. It's just very divergent thoughts, but he has really pulled it together how to relate those things. And so I can send a link or other information via Jonathan if you're interested in that. But Edward Tufte with an E at the end. Okay, so Jonathan, next slide. Thank you. So overall, one of the things that we're looking at here is that patent data is really important. And overall, what we want is that we want data, including patent data, to be informative, raise these sophisticated questions. And most of all, we want it to be actionable. What does it mean to me and my company and technology, legal space, market space, etc.? And some of those things may be addressed and some of them may not. But overall, we want it to be actionable. And so we have to balance it against your strategy, your market, your technology, other data, as in the green space that I mentioned earlier. And we want it to help us forecast where something is headed so that we know what it means to us. So overall, short-term, long-term, we want to know what's going on. And so I put up a little graphic that I happened to capture about a month ago. I'm in Austin, Texas, and I just happened to catch this on the right day. I did a screen capture for our weather forecast over the next 7 days. And I was very fortunate to see that we had some rain that was in the forecast for the first time ever. And then it was ending to become back sunny and cooler again for the first time in a long time. And so for my corollary here, weather data is actionable, and they can be actionable by anybody, even kids and us, companies, etc. And in this example, what I have is that if it's rainy and cooler, we might want to stay inside, read a book, work, pet the dog, something that doesn't necessarily require us to go outside and be wet or miserable. And then when it's sunny again, we're probably about ready to get outside and do all those things that we may be putting off. And that may be our opportunity for innovation and getting outside to go eat, go hiking, watch the kids play soccer, etc. So the deliverable of being actionable in the weather context is what is the forecast? Maybe I'll just stay inside, or maybe I'll take my coat with me, or take a rain coat, or maybe I'll go outside and meet a friend on that particular day. And so that's the actionable sense of this data that we want to reach. Maybe we get it, maybe we don't. May need some additional data to reach there, but overall, that's actionable data. So with that, I will start winding down. And I really wanted to say, again, thank you, Jonathan. You have been more than helpful as a moderator in getting me prepped for this. So I'll turn it back over to you. And you've been kind of watching the chat. Is there anything that we should discuss before we transition out of the webinar?
Sure, Steve. So folks, now we are approaching the end. Feel free to send in your questions in the live chat and comment section, and we'll load them on the stream for Steve to answer. Steve, before we move on to our audience questions, I do have just one question I'd like to ask you real quick. So you've talked a lot about the benefits of using patent data for data-driven innovation and using those insights. My question is, what, if there are any key challenges when it comes to collecting and processing patent data for those innovation purposes? Can you think of any off the top of your head that are kind of like pretty big that might lead to a common pitfall that most people experience?
Yeah, the obtaining patent data in bulk requires perhaps some budget, perhaps some in-house expertise, and maybe even a programmer if you're going to go pull down all of the data that you need, like for the USPTO. So you need some sense of a data provider. I use a data provider, a high-end worldwide data provider, and so I'm able to download large amounts of data, not maybe the huge volume that you might get from the entire USPTO. And so that data is available through specific providers, several of which I know. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to sound salesy or anything, but also you can hire the programmer, in-house person, and an analyst that knows what to look for in the data to pull that into a spreadsheet, a database, and then pull it apart. So it does require some level of activation from one of these providers generally to, how are you going to get that data?
Gotcha. Thank you for that. All right, so moving on to audience member questions. Our first question from earlier in the webinar, Brendan Godfrey, one of our IEEE volunteers. Brendan asks, you note that only 19% of patents are filed in the US. To what extent are patents duplicated from country to country?
There's actually, great question, Brendan. There's actually two ways to answer that. Patents, patent applications more properly, when they're filed, can be filed internationally. And so when those are filed internationally, like in the US, Great Britain, China, Japan, etc., typically those by the same inventor with the same idea, with the same what's known as priority date, are put into a patent family. And so those are very related patents and applications that are the same technology, same person, same date, those kind of things. And so those are often distributed worldwide, typically by larger companies because it can get expensive. But the other way to look at that same question is not necessarily what's in the same patent family from the same person or company at the same date and the same technology. I do a lot of patent research and I see things that are almost identical. In some cases, they're deliberately identical. And in fact, they're potential copycat patent applications and patents around the world. As somebody has seen, a common example is involving China, where I see a Chinese patent and then I see a US equivalent pop up here that's basically using the same drawings and everything. And it's obvious that they have copied what's published elsewhere in the hopes that no one will ever discover it. And vice versa. It happens from country to country and technology to technology. Some of those are blissfully ignorant in that they had no idea and they came up with a great idea and filed for it, hoping to get a patent. And it just happens to coincide with something that's already been described in the patent space. And they find out about that later, but they didn't know it at the time. So it can actually go in about 3 different directions.
Right, especially considering each patent has to be filed in that specific country. I'd imagine it's probably very easy to duplicate if you didn't do it in that country where it's originally patented, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Many of the examiners at the like the USPTO, for instance, will of course focus on their own database, because that's what they're focused on, is their US patenting rights and whether to approve something or not. And so they won't look as frequently as, often at other countries and other, resources. So it's kind of inherent in the system that other countries could have some things that are closely or highly or exactly related.
For sure. Thank you for that. And thank you, Brendan, for the question. Our next question, John asks, does the USPTO provide data in Tableau formats?
Not to my knowledge. They do have ways, perhaps via Python, if I can say that, that you can go to, they have a database via an API that they have set up that updates, I believe, every week, and it contains all the gruesome details and many, many gigabytes. But I don't think that they have anything specifically related to Tableau. Although once you get the data, of course, you could then put the portions of it you wish to into Tableau and then analyze it to your heart's content. I'm sure that happens.
I do a little bit of my own research on that just now. I do see, I came to the same conclusion. USPTO doesn't seem to provide that in Tableau, but you can download patent data in a format compatible with Tableau. So, John, hope that answers your question. We had not so much a question, but a statement quote from Paul. The quote is, "If you torture the data long enough, it will confess." By Ronald H.
Yes, sometimes it'll confess in the ways we want to, or maybe don't want to. It all depends on our viewpoint. So yes, as Mark Twain pointed out earlier in our presentation, maybe we need to take that with a grain of salt.
For sure. Thank you for that, Paul. And while we're on the topic of patent data as well, folks, so IEEE USA did partner with the USPTO earlier this year on a series of patent, trademark, and intellectual property webinars. So be sure to check those out. I'll provide those in the link, those links shortly. But Thanks for tuning into this one as well. This next question, our audience member asks, how much does it cost for filing a patent in case we don't have company support?
Well, that would mean, so great question. I'm not an attorney, so I can't talk necessarily statistics because I don't keep up with the USPTO fees. Most people, when I talk about all the patent attorneys that I've worked with, what I say is that you should just bank on roughly $10,000 to get your application researched, written up, added drawings, and pay the filing fees at the USPTO. So basically the whole enchilada to get your application on file from a trusted patent attorney or patent agent. And so after that, there's going to be a lull, and there's a hidden cost to that. And so that's important because all the flat rate pricing most inventors and people will see is referring to that initial chunk of cost and time. And that takes, 2-3 months, let's say, typically. But after an 18-month or so lull, what you'll see is that there will be some office actions issued by the USPTO's patent examiner or wherever you're filing. And so those office actions are going to basically be documented in a PDF that is sent back to your attorney or agent for addressing the things that, oh, there's prior art that we found that relates to your idea and we don't think it's as novel as you do, or there's some sort of problem with how you filed it, or it's obvious in that we think, well, that pencil you made that's looking at orange pencils and green pencils and blue pencils, and then you come along with a purple pencil. Well, maybe that's not so actually innovative as what you may have thought it was. And so all those things will be documented. And the important part of that is that your attorney or agent is going to flip on their hourly rate clock at that point to work with the USPTO to understand what to do and to work and suggestions as they refile their own response to that office action. And the short answer for that part of the equation is I would just bookmark another $10,000 to get through that hurdle. Of course, these are very high arching numbers, and there's all sorts of factors with number of claims. Are you over a certain age and maybe get a discount? Are you filing expedited? And all sorts of little factors that go into there. But for the most part, just bookmark $20,000 across maybe a 2-year or more period. It may not be dealt with within 2 years. You may have to come back and pay some more. So that's my shortest answer.
Thanks for that, Steve. And folks, we actually did receive a similar question during our intellectual property webinar series before, and the USPTO does have a fee schedule that they update periodically on the fees. So I've linked that in the comments section, so be sure to check that out.
Yeah.
I've also linked our IEEE USA USPTO intellectual property webinar series, our whole series in the comment section. So again, be sure to check that out. But thanks for tuning in, and thanks for your questions.
One more thing. Jonathan, I wanted to add a little bit more information. In that schedule that you're posting, the micro entity sounds like it's most appropriate to that person that asked the question. And that's important because it does give you a discount. But the numbers I quoted, are on average probably correct. But one thing about it is that the USPTO is very generous and they let inventors file their own patent applications. And because you can doesn't mean you should. And
Right.
so that's a very risky proposition that I can see from a very high level when somebody has written their own patent application. It's that obvious. And so that could be very concerning.
For sure. No, you're absolutely correct, Steve. Thanks for that. Let's see. So, folks, I think we're out of audience questions for now. But, folks, if you come up with any questions, feel free to send them in. I guess in the meantime, while we're waiting for audience member questions, Steve, I do have some more questions of my own that I'd like to ask you about. So, my next question: how can smaller businesses or startups harness the power of data-driven innovation on a limited budget? Because everyone does need to have a budget if they want to be implementing these kinds of strategies. But any thoughts on that?
Well, budgets for smaller companies is a great topic because one, most companies in my estimation at least, the ones I've worked with over the past 17 years, think they're more innovative than they actually are. They may have some smaller occasional innovations that show up as an incremental patent. But in the end of the day, it really doesn't make that much difference as far as being innovative. And that's something. But overall, this kind of data is typically used with companies that are looking to pay to set their long-term strategy and on a reoccurring basis to maintain it, perhaps before the quarterly strategy meeting comes in and we look back at the company data, what's happened in the patent space and all kinds of things. And so many small companies find that these costs may be a little bit more than what they need. And so they may revert back to something such as patent research. Let's go find out what's happened on a particular day and prior, and let's just do that search and we're done with that. Or some of the more innovative companies are interested in keeping up with the technology space, as well as some key competitors. Samsung might be interested in some of these other competitors, about what's going on. And so they may choose not necessarily to use the patent data, which they probably are if I were to guess, but they may choose to use something known as a patent alert, to where they literally get a weekly alert email that's put together that shows all the activity meeting their bounds of interest within the past week. And so it's very, not quite real time, but very lively data to say, this just happened somewhere in the world that met your expectations. And so that's a great way to kind of keep up with it. Preferably, this data would precede that so that you have a big baseline to it. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So cost is kind of determining what kind of service may be appropriate in addition to your overall needs.
Good to know. Thank you, Steve. Let's see. So we did receive a question from one of our audience members asking, will the slides be made available? Also, thanks for the great information. So folks, we'll reach out to Steve. We'll follow up with Steve after the webinar, see if he's willing to share slides. In the meantime, this webinar will be archived on our social media channels on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. So you will be able to go back and access these webinar videos on demand at any time afterwards. Thanks for tuning in. This next question, Mark asks, thoughts on small companies avoiding the patent and just publishing?
Say that again, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
Our audience member, Mark, asks, thoughts on small companies avoiding the patent and just publishing?
Oh, that goes multiple directions, and it depends on budget and interest. One thing is that you can, to use the movie Toy Story analogy, you could poison the well and you could publish your great idea out on the internet. And websites are even dedicated to this, where you talk about your innovation such that it is public knowledge. And if there should ever be a patent talking about it, you can precede it and there would never be a patent. Of course, if you did that, you would also at the same time lose your rights to protecting your idea in any fashion. Well, in this particular case, at least in the patent space. And so that could be a problem if you wish to have the ability to protect your marketplace, which essentially is what the patent space is trying to do, is you're protecting a future market. So depending on what you're trying to do, that may or may not be relevant. The most appropriate case for this is when I see companies that are getting patents and then they have some sort of minor improvement to it and they don't necessarily want to repatent every little idea they have. They may actually publish their information that's the incremental improvement to one of these websites or in other places so that it is in the public knowledge. And therefore, their patent is still protecting their idea, but they're not continuing for a continuation of patents. Some companies will actually pay for a series of provisional patent applications, which I'm not going to get into the details of, but as they have their great ideas, they will file a provisional patent application on their own. They're very simple to do and pretty cheap. And that allows them to make that decision later because it gives them 1 year to file the real patent application. And so if they really can't decide, they may file that as kind of a stopgap for them to assess their marketplace or to make other decisions internally before they decide whether to start paying money.
Great insight. Thank you, Steve. And, going back to what you said, patents really are about protection of of your ideas. I think that that's the whole point of patents and our topic on or our question regarding duplication earlier. It's possible to duplicate it, but if you don't have a patent, then you can't really get or kind of what's the word I want to say? Benefit financially from it because someone who can patent the idea, even if you don't, and has the same idea, will get all the credit.
Right.
So,
Right. And
so pretty
to
much.
that point, Jonathan, there are one of the things that most people don't realize is that 95% of the issued U.S. patents that are already granted, patents in the U.S. PTO, 95% will never make more money than it costs to actually get the patent. So that's very telling, because if your end goal is to make money, a patent may not be the way to do it because the odds are steep. That's not to say that there's not other reasons, because there are, but if your goal is financial, that may not be the best avenue. One of the many exceptions to this is if you're going in front of venture capitalists and pitching your idea, you probably want to be patent pending to protect your idea as it goes through a lot of people that may not, respect your rights. And at the same time, you can say patent pending, just like on Shark Tank. Either having a patent or saying you're patent pending catches people's attention. If I said I had a trademark or a copyright, people are going to be like, I don't care. But if I say the word patent, a lot of people's ears might perk up. So there are use cases, and it just depends on your situation and budget.
For sure. And folks, the best resource and the best way to find answers for these kinds of questions, especially regarding patents, excuse me, excuse me, if you're in the US, would most likely be the USPTO. So I would definitely try and check out their website just to see if any of those commonly asked questions and facts pages might be relevant to you. Um, it's always nice being able to have those resources available on hand. But thank you for that question, Mark. Um, so I think that's it for our audience member questions. So I think we'll just close it off with this last question. One of my last questions. My last question: how do you address concerns about patent data accuracy and reliability when using it for data-driven innovations? Any thoughts, Steve?
Well, the data is what the data is. It can be analyzed in multiple ways. So, as far as the accuracy of the data, as long as you're getting it from a trusted provider, it is, I think, accurate and complete as it will ever be. So, I don't know that there's necessarily an accuracy concern from my end that I'm aware of. And so, one of the things to be aware of is that we certainly have to be careful. For example, I have seen a number of issued US patents where there's a spelling error in the title of all places, and no one has fixed it. And so if the data is, I'm going to do a keyword search on Google or at the USPTO's patent search engine and look for everything, all the patents that include the word transistor in it, you would probably get a heck of a lot of data. How closely it related to your specific interest is dubious. But you would also likely miss some things, not only because of the spelling error that I just mentioned, but because many things won't mention the transistor aspect that you're interested in the title, or other places it may be disguised as some other word that talks about an active element and it doesn't mention the word transistor. Maybe in the specification it probably would. So there's always a sense of whether the class codes and other factors need to be balanced. Because if you're trying to find information, it may be there, but there, for a number of reasons, may not be in the form that you expected it to be for these patent analytics and other data-driven exercises.
Great, thank you. All right, folks. Well, we are now at the end. Steve, thank you so much for providing audience your insight into the power of data and how data-driven insights can really transform one's innovation journey. It's great having you with us today.
Well, again, Jonathan, thank you so much for all of your guidance leading up to the webinar and being the moderator. You're fantastic. Thank you. And I appreciate everybody that was able to join us today, even though I don't know your names. It's always great to talk to somebody. I talk a little bit too much about the subject and I get a little bit passionate about it. Pardon if I got a little fast.
Oh no, and even if you did, again, folks, you can access this webinar on demand afterwards as well. But no, Steve, everything you've provided has been fantastic. But also, thank you to our audience members for tuning in and for your great questions. If you found this webinar topic interesting, be sure to check out our other upcoming events on our website at IEEEUSA.org, IEEEUSA.org. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to IEEE USA social media channels, and check back daily for future live stream updates. Have a great day, everyone.